The perspective of former slaves. After the Civil War, the newly freed slaves weren't necessarily better off than they were under conditions of slavery. As debates raged on in the government over how to move forward, the former slaves were left with nothing. The only things that they possessed were what were given them. They were given the right to vote, they were given freedom, they were given a chance, yet deprived of opportunity. For most, there weren't many options. Another thing that affected freed men was the fact that the entire country was spinning from the economic strains of war, which left many groups going against each other for resources. As black people were considered inferior, this left them, as a whole, at the bottom of the economic ladder in every place that they turned. The perspective of former slave owners. They had the mindset, if you can't beat them with a stick, beat them with a ballot. This is how the former slaveholders in the South went about recovering in the aftermath of the Civil War. As different experiments in Reconstruction were fought over and tried, the Southern Democrats, made up mostly of former slaveholders and other Southern landowners, they wanted to establish a system of white authority. With plenty of governing experience under their belts, these men established a system of exclusion of the black population. This is a practice that remained in effect for nearly 100 years, whose legacy remains visible to this day.
The perspective of the South was very harsh. Taking up most of the population, you had the Scaglywags, and taking up only like 2% of the population in the South was the Carpetbaggers. Now, after the war, the people loyal to the Confederacy were very angry and upset, as you might imagine. However, the blacks were very rejoiceful and they were very happy. They started their own communities, started up churches within those communities, and schools. 13 colleges in the United States opened up for blacks. In 1880, 1,000 of blacks graduated from these 13 colleges. Those blacks then became school teachers for the black schools in the South. Now, with the South being harsh and rough for many blacks, they traveled north hoping for a better environment. This wasn't the case. After the Civil War, many of the whites in the North were afraid of the blacks due to their fear that they would take their jobs and work for less money. At the same time, you had immigrants migrating from Germany and Ireland and other parts of Europe, which ultimately caused more chaos than it did anything else. There ended up being groups fighting each other on the street and a lot of violence going on. This caused an enormous amount of hostility towards any groups that were coming from the South to the North or from Europe to the North.
Freedmen usually stayed working on the plantations that they were from. They either became sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Most of them were sharecroppers. They obviously didn't have enough money to purchase their own land at first, but they knew how to farm. So the freed slaves would work for the former owners, but they would then give them part of the crop after the harvest as payment for the land. There were the sharecroppers. Those that were fortunate enough to become tenant farmers made enough money from sharecropping and they were able to rent out the land themselves. When slaves became free, they were homeless. They had few possessions, were unable to feed themselves, have clothing, shelter, and take care of their family members. Most were desperately trying to find family members who were sold to other owners and other plantations and other masters. Some blacks fleeing to the Union lines for protection found themselves depending on the federal government just as much as they depended on their masters. Contraband camps were formed. Former slaves died in these camps because there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough shelter, and they started getting illnesses and getting sick. A lot of them decided to leave the camps and just go back to the plantations that they came from and see what they could do. In 1865, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau. This bureau was supposed to help the slaves get back on their feet, or former slaves get back on their feet, to help them get shelter, find some type of job, food, health care, and education. They opened 100 hospitals in the year that they were opened to help the freedmen. The slaves worked on some plantations and got paid. The Freedmen Bureau arranged this where that they could work and get paid. But slaves did not have much confidence in white people because of what happened to them as slaves. And sometimes there was controversy over things being fair for both black and white. The Freedmen Bureau only lasted a year, but it did make a big difference. Thank you.
Okay, the positives of freedom for former slaves. When the Civil War came to an end, the slaves were now free people. This meant that families who had been separated by their former master could now see each other once again. The African population was now allowed to start their own churches, and this allowed the former slaves the freedom of religion that America is so proud of. Another thing that improved for the African Americans was that they could start their own schools, and now the former slaves' children could get an education to improve their lives later on. They were also allowed to start their own little communities. And one of the biggest improvements was that the African men were now considered American citizens, and this meant that they were allowed to vote. And now the Africans had a chance to alter the government of America. However, there are negatives of freedom for the former slaves. During the post-Civil War and Reconstruction era, a slave's fight for freedom turned into a mere fight for survival. The majority of slaves were released from their previous plantations penniless, and wages for African Americans fluctuated in response to the perceived worth of that person, and manual labor was considered easily replaceable during the post-Civil War time period. With income being an issue, few ex-slaves had the ability to own land, and according to the 1880 census, 1/5 of African Americans owned at least some of the land they farmed. However, these holdings were usually beset with debt, crippling African American owners in the long run. And this prevalent poverty among ex-slaves during the Reconstruction era resulted in a lack of nourishment and medical care, which in turn caused a high mortality rate for African Americans, and especially the children. Illness left former slaves with the burden of unpaid medical bills or the inability to access proper medical care. Deficiencies caused African Americans to resort to the treatment of diseases with herbal and home remedies. And the 1900 census reveals 30 per 1,000 blacks died each year, as opposed to only 17 per 1,000 whites. Death as a result of poverty was not the only thing that affected a slave's life in the tough times of the post-Civil War era. Ex-slaves were weakened by a severe sense of isolation brought on by separation from their families. Sales of slaves, the death of owners, and the presentation of slaves as gifts during the pre-Civil War era were only some of the reasons for this division. Alienation and loneliness dampened the spirits of these slaves' newfound freedom and made the fight to survive that much harder.